REMS and EDSI are something you don't need to worry about. All you need to know from those two terms is that the effects are going to sound really natural and the sounds are going to sound absolutely marvellous, and they can sound even better when you start to really get into understanding them and programming them. Now, the Cross is basically a sample and synth engine, sometimes referred to as S&S or sample and synth. In other words, as I suggested earlier, its electronics, that is its engine, use samples and synthesis to create its sound. Well, let's explain this in a little bit more detail. A sampler effectively records a sound and uses a trigger, typically a piano style keyboard or sometimes a drum pad. As you can see, I've got an electronic drum kit, and basically they're just a trigger and a trigger for a sound. So if I press a keyboard, depress a key, it triggers a sound coming on and a sound switching off. I'll take my fingers off. Now, the Mellotron was the first sampling keyboard. It used tape loops, hardware literal tape loops, to record real sounds at different pitches, and when you played the keyboard it played the loops back. This allowed you to play tunes with different pitches, and those tunes could be with anything from a full symphony orchestra to a dog barking. Now, the sounds that were recorded for the early Yes and King Crimson albums, the Genesis albums in the 70s, you'll hear Mellotron all over it because it was cheaper than hiring really expensive real string players. And the Mellotron was used for producing horns, strings in particular, choirs, flutes. And if you go to the Genesis album Foxtrot, it opens with a track called Watcher of the Skies, and the opening's a Mellotron playing a string line. And if you haven't heard that sound before, I'll be very surprised, because it's absolutely all over those early 70s albums. Check that out on YouTube. Now, the strings aren't very realistic because the recording quality wasn't great, but it's got a character of its own, even to the extent that the Cross tries to imitate that. The Tron choir, which basically presumably is a Mellotron choir, sounds very little like a realistic choir, but it sounds like a Mellotron produced choir. So they're even trying to produce these vintage instruments to generate the sort of sounds that you got on those early progressive rock albums. In the modern age, the tapes have gone, and the electronics have allowed a very well recorded sound to be stored digitally within the box or on a PC, ready for playback. There are now high quality recordings and not a tape in sight. But like the Mellotron, the Cross uses samples of real sounds, and this allows you to play them back across the entire keyboard at different pitches simply by pressing one or more keys. If you switch the Korg on and select a piano sound, it will be a digital recording of a real piano you can control from your keyboard. But it could equally be a recording of another synth, as is the case with something like the sine lead, for example.